Hello and welcome to Cloudforest Vibes. My name's Bobby, and this is how I grow orchids and carnivorous plants. Hello and welcome to Cloudforest Vibes. Today's video, we're going to be going through some plants and we're going to be updating some moss and making some arrangements and adjustments on their growing conditions and situations so they can grow better and be happy throughout this season. I got started doing this the other day on video and I actually got interrupted. So I've got a couple plants I've already done, which we'll look at later on, but there's still lots of plants in here that need some help, that need a little bit of a freshening up, so to speak. And I'm hoping to get a lot of that done today. I have a little bit of extra time. It's a beautiful sunny day, so I want to get some stuff done early so I can spend some time in here when it's nice and warm and tropical and then hopefully be able to get out later and even try to collect some moss from a local trail I know. So lots and lots to do today. I may take you with me on that journey as well. I haven't decided yet, but for now we're going to be updating mosses. A lot of people have asked me to do this video and see how I do it. And it's really easy, guys, so we're going to get to it and I will show you exactly how I update and upgrade moss on mounts and try to make sure my plants have the best ideal growing situation for every new season. So without any further hesitation, we're going to get into this. I'm going to go in here and look at a couple of the plants we're going to be working on, and then we're going to take them out to the table and we're going to get cracking. So here we go. So we're here looking at my Dendrobium tetragonum. This is one of the plants on my list. As you can see, the moss is definitely starting to come back alive. This is just zombie moss. I did not put any live moss on this mount. That definitely needs some help here. I've got my Dendrochilum here, which I did recently do, but the moss is already getting a little bit manky. I think I might leave this one out, but it's definitely on my watch list. We will monitor this plant together and we'll see, but I have saved this plant successfully from its doom on this mount before where it stayed far too moist, and I have grown it a bit moist in the winter and the moss has really started to kind of take hold. This is live moss that has made its way onto this mount, so we'll monitor this. It doesn't stink yet, but it is on my watch list. Its other friend down here though, I got this from Louisiana Orchid Connection last year. This is Dendrochilum wenzelii. It has grown pretty well. I keep this mount extremely moist. Probably too moist, to be honest, so I want to get this moss off of here. You guys get a closer look at it. I want to get this moss off of here. It's starting to come back alive. It does smell a bit. There are roots. I do see roots coming out the bottom of this thing and doing alright, but I would like to catch this plant before it's too late, freshen up the media, and give it the best chance to hopefully bloom this year. I would love to see this plant bloom. This down here is my Mormolica rufescens, and this plant, it's making some new roots. It is a perfect time to get this old moss. This moss has been on here for a couple years. It needs to come off. It definitely stinks, and give this plant a good chance. You can see some of the older roots in there dying, and I do believe the pH of this mount is probably getting a bit too low. The latest growth it pushed out is nice, really big new growth. And I want to keep the momentum on this plant because it has been a real bear nursing this thing back to health when I got it from Equigenera. My Dendrobium rotostictum here, it hardly has any moss on the mount left, but I think it really needs to be freshened up as well. I'm starting to lose some of my older canes, so I do remember I think I put moss underneath this plant, and I want to change that immediately. I want to get some more moss on the outskirts of this thing, kind of thinly scattered around this mount. I'm going to leave the plant on there. It does really well mounted, but I really want to give it an extra push. I'm giving it some more light in the hopes that it blooms, and freshening up this media should really help this plant as well. This plant is my Diplo colobium fariniferum. This plant has like really grown well. I mean, it has probably quadrupled in size or more since I got it couple years ago, but another one that really needs some help. The moss on this mount is old, it's manky, it is nasty, and it's going to get a change today, finally. Never bloomed this plant. It's kind of a fussy bloomer. It needs really good temperature and light conditions. You've got to get the right balance in order to get it happy enough to bloom. So this year I'm growing it pretty bright. It's been growing in the deep shade, it's grown in bright shade, it's grown in all kinds of conditions. The only thing I haven't done is give it bright light. So we're going to give it bright light this year, and to help it out, we're going to give it some new moss. We're going to keep it on this mount, let it bush out, and just hope that we have a really good blooming, because like I said, we've got tons and tons of growths, tons of growth points. If it ever does decide to bloom, it should be quite a show. That's it for now. We got a bunch of other plants to look at some point in time and assess, but I think this is a great start for today, and we'll get cracking here immediately. I'm going to go set up at the table, and I will see you guys in just a few moments. Alright, so we've got our 4 plants out here, and I'm going to go ahead and start with this one. I think it's going to be the easiest. I'm going to cheat a little bit, and then we'll go from there. This is Dendrobium tetragonum. Like I said, I got it last year. It's actually 2 plants if I remember correctly, and it badly needs new moss. So we're going to start by getting this string cut off. I will get the camera in closer so you guys can see exactly what I do here. Alright, so we've got our line off, and first things first, from the bottom of the mount, I'm just going to start gently teasing this moss and see what comes off. Oh yeah, it stinks. Some of these roots aren't super happy, which is definitely what I expected. And that is exactly why we're doing this. So, start to pick with our tweezers and remove this moss from the good roots, because we do want to keep this plant attached to this mount. I will be back in just a moment once I've got more of this cleaned up, and I will show you the finished product. So I've got this plant pretty well cleaned up now. There are some roots here that I'm going to tend to. I'm going to nip them back a little bit to a healthier portion. There are a couple dead roots in here, but overall they look pretty good. They were buried down in some of this nasty moss that we're still getting just the last little bit out of. But this plant has actually attached pretty well to the mount. It lives on there on its own now, which is exactly what you want. And I have removed all the moss from underneath this section of roots so we can ensure that they live happier and healthier for the long term. Now, something I like to do when I'm upgrading moss on my mounts is to really thoroughly clean the mount off of the old moss. So zoom out here, you guys can see what I'm doing. I take my standard sprayer, I put it on the jet, and I really give a good jetting to the under area where the moss used to be. That gets off all the little bits, any loose bits, things like that, and it'll help you clean up and see exactly what you're looking at before you take the next step and try to get clean moss on there. And you'll see all the stuff that comes off. I don't like running my orchids under the tap. My tap water here is absolutely filthy, high in mineral content and all kinds of other bad stuff, so these orchids never see true tap water for any reason. I will rinse my mounts off sometimes, but once the orchid's attached, that's an absolute no-go for me. So I've got my alcohol-soaked scissors. We're going to go in here. We're going to trim up some of these roots. I'm going to go ahead and get this squared away with its new moss, and then we'll move on to the next plant and take a look at them all once we're all done. Next up, we're going to take a look at our Dendrochilum wenzelii. This again I got last year from Louisiana Orchid Connection. It came potted. It was really unhappy actually in its pot. You could tell it had stayed too moist for too long, and I promptly put it on this mount in the hopes that it could stay moist but also get plenty of air around its roots. So we're going to pull this line off and and see what we've got, because I do know it did put on root growth last year, which made me really happy to see. But I do not want to stunt its root growth by letting this moss go too long without getting changed. We've got all of our line off, and again, first step here is we're just going to start teasing this moss away from the bottom of the mount. Oh wow. Roots right there, look at that. That is good to see. I always like to start toward the bottom of the mount because the roots tend to grow away. And that way you're kind of pulling moss out of the roots. And I find it to be a lot easier that way. Some really nice live zombie moss there. Alright, it's tweezer time. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and work to get this cleaned up. We'll be back again to take a look at it when it's a little bit closer. Alrighty, so this plant is more or less moss free. I just wanted to show you guys I had lots and lots of root growth. Some of them died off, but I think a lot of these dead ones were ones that were on when I got the plant. You can see some bark still in there attached, and I've never had this thing in bark myself. All this stuff on this side is mine. A lot of them grew toward the surface of the moss, so I'm going to go ahead and put moss back on here, but perhaps not so thick. I'm going to lessen the amount, perhaps have to water a little more frequently, but most Dendrochilums do like to be relatively moist, so I'm going to get this thing sprayed off. I'll show you how effective this jet method is. Again, you want the jet, and you're just going to spray. So again, look at all the junk that takes off. Really does a good job. And it'll let you get down and focus on the last little bit of moss if you want to get the last little bit out of there. It also helps knock free dead portions of roots. So you see all the stringy bits. You can go ahead and distinguish between what's alive and what's dead very easily that way. The jet will not hurt living tissue of this plant, I promise. So, all these little scrappy bits, I'm going to go ahead and do the best I can to painstakingly free them of these roots. Make sure there's nothing lurking underneath. I'll give some of these dead roots here a trim back to where they're alive again, and then we'll be moving on to our next plant. So that is Dendrochilum wenzelii. I'm going to get this thing buttoned up, and we'll go take a look at the next one. So I've got our next plant here. This is Diplo colobium farinifrum. Had this plant a few years now. It's very reluctant to bloom. It's a tougher blooming orchid. They need really precise conditions. I guess I haven't hit that happy medium yet. As I mentioned before, I'm starting to grow this plant much more bright than I ever have, in the hopes that I can really get this thing happy. But this moss is nasty, and I'm fully expecting a plant full of dead roots. It has been far too long on this mount without getting any attention. So once I can figure out how I have this thing tied on here, we'll get the rest of this line off and we'll start digging in, but I'm already seeing some unhappy roots, so I'll be back in a moment. As I was taking this line off, like I said, I can already see some really unhappy roots here. This is another one. I believe I sat this plant, on moss instead of putting the plant on the mountain first and then mossing around it, so this is going to be a little bit of a task. Again, we're going to start at the bottom, pick away what we can. I think some of this plant's going to end up coming off of this mount and getting reattached, but I am seeing some pretty unhappy back sections of this plant already. The plant is, as you see, swinging right there, which means the roots probably are dead. So I'm going to go ahead and get this plant probably off this mount. Oof, yeah, hideous. Alrighty guys, drastic times call for drastic measures, so we are going to spray this thing down. I'm going to go ahead and just unmount this plant, and we are going to start over. The jet alone is taking this moss off. It is just disintegrating. So, yeah, I'll let this thing go way too long. There are some roots, but yeah, the very bottom sections of these plants are not very happy right now. So we're going to go ahead and just, from the bottom, peel, get as much of this plant off of here as we can, because it's not happy. So unfortunately, what you see here is that lovely big Diplo farnifrum. It is now 6 pieces. I know for a fact that was not 6 pieces when it went on there, but the rhizome is rotted in a few spots. Some of these leads have separated, and if you can't tell, maybe you'll be able to tell if I do this, but lots and lots of these roots are just gone. I mean, absolutely gone. Terrible. They got too far gone last year when I didn't change out this media. So this plant is basically going to have to start over. It's really unfortunate, but I'll get it strapped back onto its mount and get it going again. I think this would be a perfect candidate for tree fern. It has a rambling kind of habit. I don't know if this is a perfect example, but it has leads that grow, they split, kind of like your Dyneema, kind of like a Maxillaria or something, and it grows from one point to many points really fast and spreads out. So it likes to stay relatively moist, but it does like to get a lot of air to its roots again, like most orchids. And I do believe that something like tree fern fiber would be perfect for this kind of plant. So I'm going to get some on order here soon, and hopefully we can avoid all this rotting of old growth and rotting of roots on the next time around with this plant. But for now, it's going to go back onto its cork mount with just a little bit of moss, and we are going to keep a real close eye on this plant because it definitely needs some help. So last but not least, we have our Dendrobium rotostictum. This plant's been in my collection for a few years now. Been on this mount for a few years, and I have never updated this moss. There was only a tiny little bit of moss on here to begin with. This plant had 0 roots. It came to me from Ecuagenera, small, yellow, and just completely rootless and unhappy. So I took some time. This was the first, this was actually the first orchid I ever did the trick where you just sit it on moist sphagnum moss in a pot. It started to finally grow some new growths, and consequently it grew new roots from there. But after it started to grow some new growths, I strapped it onto this mount with just a tiny bit of moss, and it has since taken to this mount. There is no string, no line on this mount, just the orchid. So I want to be extremely careful not to damage any of these roots. They're still in good shape, even though the moss needs to be changed, and the moss goes underneath the orchid. So this is going to be a little bit tricky, but we absolutely do not want to damage any part of this plant. So I've got an old pseudobulb here that's yellowing that needs to come off. I've had a couple other ones in the middle. They do that when they get older and die. Once they turn yellow, they are no longer good for the plant. You can snip them off. I put cinnamon on the wound and get it back to growing. So what I'm going to do here again, very gently, is take this moss with my tweezers and just start to pull a little bit and tug gently until it comes out from underneath this orchid. I I do want to leave it attached to this mount. It is a really happy plant, but it just needs a freshen up before it goes downhill. So this one's the one I've been most worried about. I'm going to get it moist, let things kind of loosen up just a little bit. And we'll dive in here and start trying to get some of this moss off of here. Again, this is a prime reason why you do not put the moss underneath the orchid, but in the case of this plant, when I first put it on this mount, it was almost a requirement in a way. I guess I didn't have to. Knowing what I know now, I would have waited a little bit longer until it had started to show roots before I mounted it. Then I wouldn't have had to have this issue, but for now, we just have to get this moss out and get this plant cleaned up, which I'm going to do right now, and I'll be back. So far so good. I've gotten most of the moss off from this area. It was a very thin layer. Fortunately, I didn't cake it on here very thick. I didn't want to smother the roots of this plant. I watch a lot of Rogers orchids. That's where I found this plant first, and he had some issues with them one winter where he let them stay too wet. I'm sure you guys know the story. So I did not want to repeat that mistake off of his advice. So I didn't put much moss on this mount. I do water it quite often. It gets frequent fresh waterings, and that's how I keep it moist. But in the wintertime, it is able to get dry if I want it to get dry, despite the fact that there is moss underneath this orchid. So this is going to be the real painstaking part. I'm exposing new roots everywhere, and I really don't want to disturb them. I really don't want to mess them up. So I'm gently, with the tweezers closed, kind of just raking some of this stuff out from underneath it. Again, it is painstaking. This plant is going to take me some time to get fully cleaned up, but I wanted to show you guys my little process. So once you find moss, you can grab it and tug, but when it gets far gone, it'll just break apart. So your best bet is getting in there, gently poking it around, raking it around, loosening it up, and then going back with the sprayer like I showed you earlier. And getting in there to clean up all those fine bits that we've loosened up. Definitely the best way to ensure as little disturbance to the roots as possible. Water is gentle, but again, water is also very forceful. So, if you can, use it to your advantage whenever you're trying to clean up your orchid mounts. The first person I saw use water was Brad. He sprays it with his sink sprayer. Unfortunately, again, I don't have that luxury, so I use my little mister. And it works just fine, guys. It works really, really good. As you can see, we've cleaned up a lot more of these roots down here. I'm going to try to flip the plant around and get to the top side of it here. So I am going to continue on with this and try to get all this moss off of here. And I'll be back in a few minutes once we do, and I'll show you what we're going to do with this plant. So we're back here with our orchid. I've got it nice and cleaned up. The majority of this moss is gone. There's still a little bit in a couple places underneath here I don't think I'm going to be able to get to without tearing this plant off. So we are just going to go ahead and leave it. The roots are in pretty good condition. There's new roots forming now at the base. There's root tips on them, if I don't break it. New growth. And there is a small dead section of old plant here. It's towards the back of the mount. Again, there's lots of new root growth back there where the plant has and is attaching itself to this mount, so I'm not going to do anything about it now. If I see any kind of decline, this plant will of course have to come off of here anyway. But for now, it's loving the mount. I'm going to go ahead and sparsely cover this mount with zombie moss again. It really seems to like it, but I'm going to go a little bit more. So really sparsely again. I'm not going to crowd the roots. I'm not going to put this in any sort of a situation where it's going to be unhappy long term. The roots do like a lot of air. They just like moisture as well. So we're going to make sure this plant has a lot of that, and hopefully get this darn thing to bloom again this year, because this is basically, I think, my absolute favorite Dendrobium bloom. Definitely my favorite Latoria. So I'll get this tended to. We'll go take a look at all the plants that we worked on today in the grow room, and then a couple more that I worked on a few days ago. So here we go. So I'm here with the finished product of all 4 of our plants, looking nice and fresh with new moss on their mounts. These plants are undoubtedly going to live a lot happier now, and we can rest easily knowing that we've saved roots that would otherwise be gone this season, kind of like this guy. So I'm going to get these plants put away in the greenhouse, and we'll take a look at them, where they live, and some of the other plants I've been working on. So I am back in the tent. We have our Dendrobium tetragonum here, our Dendrochilum wenzelii, our Dendrobium rotostictum, our Diplo colobium fariniferum, and I forgot to record it, but I did actually remember as I was putting plants back that we were doing the Mormolica rufescens as well. This plant actually had some really nice roots on it. Trimmed a few off, but overall it was really healthy, really nice. I put some new moss on, and hopefully this plant is set to grow another season. I would love to see this thing bloom. I've moved it up recently. It was in the depths back here in one of these back shelves, and it's grown pretty well. But now that it's got a nice established root system, I think I'm going to try a little bit more light and see if I can't get this sucker to bloom. Anyhow, I've done my Dendrobium dichioides here. I don't know if we looked at this the other day or not, but if we didn't, that's that. I did the Oncidium verrucosum. I did my Twinkle. That's pink profusion there. I did the Lodogesii and several others in the tank and in here as well. So I'm going to keep up the good work. I'm going to keep working hard on all these mounts. I've got so freaking many mounts in here. Little ones, big ones, and most of them need some love. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next couple videos between here and the tank. I think the next video is going to be more focused on the tank. A lot of these plants in here as well really need some love. I've worked on that one. I've worked on, let's see, my Lepanthes fimbriata and a couple others in here, but we're going to go through, pick out a bunch of these Lepanthes and give them a nice revamp here in our next video. So that'll probably be tomorrow, but I don't know when you'll see it. But anyhow, until next time, thank you guys for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. Updating moss on mounts can be a real daunting task sometimes. I know none of us want to damage our roots or cause any issues in the near future, any setbacks, so it can be really daunting, but don't worry guys, I promise you, getting new moss on the mounts is the most important thing, and even if you do cause a little bit of damage here and there, it's still in the long run going to be better for the plant than leaving the moss on and letting the whole thing go downhill. So I hope you learned again at least that much, and do not make the same mistakes I've made with some of the plants we saw today and let them go too long, because you see the effects. Anyhow, as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, please stay safe and happy growing.